More than 10 days after a devastating earthquake hit Turkey and Syria, rescue and humanitarian relief efforts continue. However, although as many as 30 nations have mobilized to give aid to Turkey, Syria has largely been a neglected sideshow. Only a handful of countries, India included, have sent emergency supplies to both Turkey and Syria. At present, India has flown 7 C-17 airplanes with relief material to Ankara and Damascus. However, Syria has received little in aid from Western nations like the United States. Meanwhile, those same countries have mobilized to give millions in aid to Turkey, which is Syria's next door neighbor. So, is the West neglecting Syria? The answer is that it's complicated. Much of the tension between the West and Syria revolves around one man, Bashar al-Assad, who rules as dictator of Syria. Assad, who has fought a bloody civil war against Islamist groups and other rebels since 2011, has been condemned in the West for the violence he has inflicted on his own people. This included violent crackdowns on protests in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring in the early 2010s. Assad also stands accused of chemical bombings against his own citizens, which took place in 2013. Ostracized and sanctioned by the West, Assad's regime has remained isolated internationally. India, however, has maintained its relationship with Damascus, and high-level diplomatic ties have continued. Syria's foreign minister visited New Delhi in November 2022. There are a few key reasons for this. First, India prefers a pragmatic policy of engagement in its foreign affairs and has thus avoided taking sides in the Syrian conflict. Second, Russia is a key backer of the Assad regime and has intervened militarily on his side. Given India's close strategic relationship with Moscow, New Delhi has kept its contacts with Assad alive. Both countries also face significant security threats from terror groups like ISIS. Throughout the Syrian civil war, India has provided development aid, medical relief, and other forms of support for the Assad regime. When the earthquake hit Syria on the morning of February 6, 2023, India rushed to continue its policy of aid to the embattled Assad regime. This approach differs from the West's handling of the crisis. When the earthquake hit, Western governments' efforts to provide aid was stymied by their difficult relationship with the Syrian government. There are a few key reasons for this. While the West wants to provide aid through local Syrian NGOs and the United Nations, Assad wants aid to be distributed throughout the country by his government's agencies. The West has refused this request for two reasons. First, analysts have argued that aid to Assad's government may not make it to earthquake-affected regions in the country's northwest. Instead, they argue, Syria's government is likely to absorb the aid money and use it to strengthen its influence to fight and win the country's ongoing civil war. The earthquake-affected northwest regions are held by rebel Syrian opposition groups and not by Assad's government. To give him aid to distribute throughout the country would mean implicitly acknowledging his regime's claim over these regions. Assad's government has also protested that Western sanctions imposed for the last decade have made aid flows to Syria difficult in this time of crisis. America and Europe have pushed back on that claim, stating that their sanctions have clear exemptions for humanitarian aid. The US government also announced a general waiver exempting any earthquake aid-related efforts from sanctions. However, despite these efforts, substantial aid flows remain blocked without major funding from Western governments. Instead of working with the Assad administration in Damascus, the West has tried other tactics to funnel aid into the country. Attempts have been made to work with local NGOs in Syria, who unfortunately lack the capacity and experience to handle millions of dollars in aid funding. Western governments have also tried to ferry aid to Syria's northwest through the United Nations. For years, the UN has supplied relief and aid to millions living in the country's rebel-held northwest through a single border crossing from Turkey. Given the scale of the crisis, that one route has proved inadequate to supply all the aid that Syria needs. While the West has made efforts to create new border crossing routes, the Syrian government has resisted these proposals. For Assad, it would mean accepting Western powers undercutting his government's legitimacy by refusing to work with him. While the West has been hamstrung by red tape and bureaucratic workarounds, India has willingly flown aid directly to the Syrian government. Its relief efforts, which have attracted appreciation from Damascus, speak to New Delhi's pragmatic policy on dealing with the Syrian government. This is also consistent with New Delhi's previous policy on humanitarian aid. In 2021, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, India called for countries to provide aid to Syria without allowing politics and prior disagreements to get in the way of emergency relief to affected populations. After a decade-long civil war, Syria lacks the capacity it needs to respond to this crisis. While the West squabbles with the Assad regime, ordinary citizens in the country are struggling to survive this latest calamity. If the West wants to live up to its own standards, it might do well to take a page out of India's book.